The courtroom held its breath as 8-year-old Jamal Carter raised his small, trembling finger, pointing directly at Officer Daniel Hargrove. His eyes, wide and unyielding, locked onto the man in the crisp blue uniform, whose badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. In that frozen moment, the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths pressed against the walls, threatening to crack them open. Jamal wasn't supposed to be here. No child should have to stand in a courtroom, facing a man whose authority loomed larger than life itself. But there he was, a slight figure in a faded red hoodie, his sneakers scuffed from running through the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood. The judge, a woman with gray streaks in her hair and a face carved with years of hard decisions, leaned forward. The prosecutor fidgeted with his pen. The defense attorney's smirk faltered. And the crowd, mothers clutching tissues, activists whispering, reporters scribbling, went deathly silent. What could a boy like Jamal, born into a world that judged him before he could speak, possibly say to silence a room? 2 weeks earlier, the city of Crestwood had erupted. A grainy cell phone video had spread like wildfire across social media, showing Officer Hargrove pinning Jamal's father, Marcus Carter, to the pavement outside their apartment complex. Marcus, a mechanic with calloused hands and a laugh that could fill a room, had been on his way home from the late shift. The video captured Hargrove's knee on Marcus's back, his voice barking commands, while Marcus's "please, I didn't do anything," echoed into the night. Jamal, watching from the stoop, had screamed for his father, his small voice drowned out by the chaos. The official report claimed Marcus had resisted arrest after a routine stop. The charge? Loitering. The evidence? A wrench in his pocket, which Hargrove called a weapon. But the video told a different story, one of a black man targeted for existing, his dignity stripped in front of his son. By morning, protests had flooded the streets, signs reading, "Justice for Marcus," waving under tear gas clouds. The city was a tinderbox, and Jamal, though only 8, understood more than most. He'd seen the looks at the grocery store, the way people crossed the street when he and his dad walked together. He'd heard his mother, Lena, whisper about the system when she thought he was asleep. Now, in the courtroom, the system stared back at him. Hargrove sat tall in the witness stand, his jaw set, his story polished. Marcus had been aggressive, a threat to public safety. The defense attorney painted a picture of a dangerous man, a stereotype that hung heavy in the air. Jamal's mother sat in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles paled. She'd told Jamal to tell the truth, no matter how scared he felt. But the truth was a heavy thing for a boy to carry, especially when it meant facing a man who could make his world crumble. The prosecutor, a young man named Eric Ruiz with a nervous energy, had called Jamal to testify. It was a risky move. Children were unpredictable, easily dismissed. But Ruiz had seen something in Jamal's eyes when they'd met in the cramped office the day before, a fire, a clarity that cut through the noise. "You saw what happened, Jamal," Ruiz had said. "Your voice matters." Jamal hadn't believed him. Voices like his didn't matter in Crestwood, not when men like Hargrove held the power. Yet here he was, standing, pointing, his heart pounding so loud he thought it might burst. "Jamal Carter," the judge said, her voice firm but not unkind, "please tell the court what you saw that night." The room tilted. Jamal's throat felt dry, his tongue heavy. He glanced at his mother, who gave a small nod, her eyes glistening. He looked at his father, seated at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders slumped but his gaze steady. Marcus had always told Jamal, "Fear's just a shadow, son. Step into the light." Jamal took a breath, his small chest rising, and spoke. He didn't do anything wrong. His voice was soft but clear, slicing through the room like a blade. "My dad was just walking home. He was singing. He always sings when he's happy." Then that man, he pointed again at Hargrove, his finger unwavering now, he grabbed him. Threw him down. Called him names. My dad wasn't fighting. He was begging. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hargrove shifted in his seat, his face tightening. The defense attorney stood, objecting, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Let the boy speak," she said. Jamal's voice grew stronger, fueled by a memory he couldn't unsee. "I was on the stoop. I saw it all. Dad dropped his wrench when he fell. He wasn't gonna hurt nobody. That man," he pointed again, his arm steady now, he kept hitting him. "Said he was dangerous. But my dad's not dangerous. He fixes cars. He tucks me in at night. He's my dad." The room was a vacuum, every breath held. Hargrove's eyes darted to the floor, then back to Jamal, a flicker of something: guilt, anger, fear crossing his face. The defense attorney tried again, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, this is a child's perspective, unreliable." "Enough," the judge snapped. "Continue, Jamal." Jamal swallowed, his small frame trembling but his resolve ironclad. "I heard my dad say, I'm not resisting. He said it over and over. But that man didn't listen. He kept hitting him. And then he looked at me. He told me to go inside or I'd be next." A gasp rose from the crowd. Lena covered her mouth, tears spilling over. The reporters scribbled faster, their pens scratching like a chorus of accusation. The prosecutor, Ruiz, stood frozen, as if he hadn't expected this. Even the judge's composed mask cracked, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Hargrove. "Did Officer Hargrove say anything else to you?" Ruiz asked, his voice careful but urgent. Jamal nodded, his lips trembling. "He said, this is what happens when you don't know your place." I didn't know what he meant then. But I do now. The courtroom erupted. Shouts of outrage, cries of disbelief. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order, but the air was electric, charged with the weight of Jamal's words. Hargrove's face was a storm red, taut, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. The defense attorney scrambled, his objections lost in the chaos. Jamal stood still, his finger still pointed, his eyes locked on Hargrove. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a witness, a voice, a truth the room couldn't ignore. For weeks, Crestwood had been divided. Half the city saw Marcus as a victim, a man targeted for his skin. The other half saw Hargrove as a hero, a cop doing his job in a dangerous world. The protests had grown violent, storefronts shattered, families torn apart by arguments over dinner tables. But in this moment, Jamal's words cut through the noise, forcing everyone to confront the reality of what had happened that night. The trial had begun as a formality, a way to quiet the unrest. Hargrove's record was clean, his story backed by his partner, Officer Tate, who testified earlier, parroting the same narrative. Marcus was a threat, the stop was routine, the force was necessary. But Jamal's testimony was a crack in that facade, a light shining through. Ruiz stepped forward, his voice steady now. "Jamal, can you tell us why you're here today, even though you're scared?" Jamal looked at his father, then back at the prosecutor. "Because my dad taught me to tell the truth. Even when it's hard. Even when people don't listen. I want my dad to come home. I want people to stop looking at us like we're bad." The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that feels like the world holding its breath. Even the defense attorney sat down, his argument spent. Hargrove's shoulders slumped, his bravado crumbling under the weight of a child's honesty. The judge cleared her throat, her voice softer now. "Thank you, Jamal. You may step down." But Jamal didn't move. Not yet. He looked at Hargrove one last time, his small voice carrying a weight no one could measure. "You hurt my dad. But you can't hurt the truth." The crowd erupted again, some cheering, some sobbing. Lena rushed to Jamal as he stepped down, pulling him into her arms. Marcus, still seated, covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. The judge banged her gavel, but her eyes were on Jamal, a flicker of admiration in them. The trial wasn't over, but something had shifted. Jamal's words had done more than silence the room. They'd cracked open a wound Crestwood had ignored for too long. The question now was whether the city, and the system, would listen. As the courtroom buzzed, Ruiz leaned down to Jamal, whispering, "You did good, kid. You did real good." Jamal nodded, but his eyes were on his father, who looked back with a pride that no handcuffs could dim. The rest of the trial would test them all. Hargrove's defense would fight back, spinning narratives, digging into Marcus's past for any flaw to exploit. The city outside would roil, protests growing louder, the divide deepening. But Jamal's moment in that courtroom, his small finger pointing, his voice steady, had planted a seed. Truth, once spoken, has a way of taking root. The days following Jamal's testimony were a storm. Crestwood streets pulsed with protests, some peaceful, others clashing with police lines under the glare of news cameras. Social media amplified every angle, hashtags like Justice for Marcus and Back the Blue Ward for dominance, splitting neighbors, co-workers, even families. Lena Carter kept Jamal close, shielding him from the TV where pundits dissected his words, some calling him a hero, others a pawn. Marcus remained in custody, his fate hanging on the trial's outcome. But Jamal's moment in court had shifted something intangible, a ripple that refused to fade. Officer Hargrove's defense team doubled down. They painted Marcus as a man with a history, a speeding ticket from a decade ago, a dropped charge from his youth, small infractions twisted into a portrait of menace. They called Officer Tate back to the stand, who swore Marcus had lunged at Hargrove, justifying the force. Tate's story was smooth, rehearsed, but his eyes darted too often, betraying cracks in his confidence. The prosecution, led by Eric Ruiz, chipped away at those cracks, presenting neighbors who'd filmed the incident, their videos contradicting Tate's account. One showed Marcus's hands raised, empty, before Hargrove's baton struck. Jamal, though, remained the heart of the case. His testimony replayed in minds across Crestwood, shared in clips online, his small voice cutting through the noise. Community leaders rallied at the courthouse steps, holding signs with his words, "You can't hurt the truth." But truth was a battlefield. Hargrove supporters, mostly white, mostly from the city's wealthier suburbs, argued he was a cop under pressure, doing his job in a dangerous neighborhood. Marcus's supporters, black, Latino, and working-class families from the East Side, saw a system that targeted them daily, Hargrove just its latest face. In the courtroom, the defense tried to discredit Jamal. They questioned his age, his memory, suggesting he'd been coached. Ruiz countered fiercely, calling a child psychologist who testified that trauma like Jamal's sharpened recollection, not blurred it. Lena took the stand next, her voice steady but raw, recounting how Marcus had been stopped by police 3 times that year alone, each time for nothing: walking, driving, existing. "They see his skin and assume," she said, her eyes locking on the jury. "They don't see the man who braids his son's hair, who works overtime to pay our rent." The jury, a mix of faces, black, white, young, old, listened intently. Some nodded at Lena's words, others sat stone-faced. Crestwood's divide was mirrored in their eyes, a microcosm of a city wrestling with itself. The judge, Patricia Wells, kept order with a gavel and a gaze that missed nothing. She'd seen cases like this before, but Jamal's testimony lingered, a weight she couldn't shake. As closing arguments neared, Hargrove took the stand again. He stuck to his story: Marcus was a threat, the wrench a weapon, the force necessary. But under Ruiz's cross-examination, he faltered. "Why didn't you de-escalate?" Ruiz pressed. "Why strike a man pleading for calm?" Hargrove's answers grew clipped, his face flushed. "I followed protocol," he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. When Ruiz played the video Marcus's pleas, Jamal's screams in the background, Hargrove looked away, his hands clenching. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, ready to burst. Outside, protests swelled, police in riot gear forming lines. A local pastor, Reverend Ellis, stood between marchers and officers, urging peace. "This isn't just about Marcus," he told a reporter. "It's about every black man, woman, child who's been told they don't belong. His words, like Jamal's, went viral, fueling debates in homes and barbershops, on X and in church pews. On the final day, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. Jamal sat with Lena in a small waiting room, coloring a picture of a superhero he'd drawn for his dad. "Will Daddy come home?" he asked, his crayon pausing. Lena hugged him, whispering, "We're fighting for it, baby." She didn't promise, couldn't, but her grip was fierce. Ruiz joined them, his tie loosened, exhaustion lining his face. "You changed things, Jamal," he said. "No matter what, you did that." When the jury returned, the courtroom was packed, air thick with anticipation. Judge Wells read the verdict, not guilty. Marcus was cleared of all charges: resisting arrest, assault, all of it. A cry broke from Lena, her hands covering her face. Jamal leapt into her arms, sobbing, "Daddy's coming home." The crowd erupted: cheers, tears, some angry mutters from Hargrove supporters. Marcus, released from the defendant's table, knelt and pulled Jamal close, whispering, "You're my hero, son." But the victory was bittersweet. Hargrove faced no charges, the system shielded him, as it often did. He'd returned to duty, his badge untarnished, though Internal Affairs launched a review after public outcry. The city simmered, some celebrating Marcus's freedom, others decrying a miscarriage of justice. Reverend Ellis organized a town hall, inviting all sides to speak. "Healing starts with listening," he said, but the room was tense, voices clashing over accountability, reform, trust. Marcus and Lena shielded Jamal from the fallout, moving him to a new school to escape the spotlight. At night, Marcus read him stories, his voice a steady anchor. "You stood up, Jamal," he'd say. "That's power." Lena started a community group, Mothers for Justice, channeling her pain into action: workshops, legal aid, voter drives. Slowly, Crestwood began to shift. A new police chief promised reforms, though skepticism ran deep. Small changes came: body cameras mandated, community policing pilots. But the divide remained, a wound not yet healed. Jamal, now 9, carried his truth quietly. He'd play basketball with friends, laugh like any kid, but his eyes held a depth beyond his years. One day, walking home with Marcus, he saw a police car pass. He tensed, then relaxed when Marcus squeezed his hand. "Not all of them are bad," Marcus said. "But we keep speaking up, okay?" Jamal nodded, his small voice firm. "Okay, Dad." The story of Marcus Carter didn't end in that courtroom. It lived in the protests, the debates, the quiet moments when families like his dared to hope. It lived in Jamal, a boy who faced fear and spoke anyway, his words a spark that lit Crestwood ablaze. The city, like the nation, stood at a crossroads between division and understanding, silence and truth. What side are you on? What will you say when the room falls silent?